Now let us look at the next major category of bank. They are private sector banks. What are private sector banks? In private sector banks, the shares are held by the public. The owners of private sector bank is not government. The government of India does not have even a single share, does not own even a single share in any of the private sector banks. The shares are held by the public. Why private sector bank came into existence? Private sector banks were with us from time immemorial, long time. First bank of Hindustan was started long back. And when Indira Gandhi nationalized 14 banks and then 6 banks, she only nationalized the top 10 or 15 banks. What happened to the remaining banks? The remaining banks, which were small by their size and stature, they continued to serve as private sector banks, even though they were started in 1935, 1940 and all. So, under private sector banks, we have two categories. One category is called old private sector bank and the other category is called new private sector bank. What are the old private sector banks? Old private sector banks were with us from 1935 onwards, which were not nationalized by Indira Gandhi. So they continued to remain as a private sector bank and they continued to play their game in the private sector. Then 1990 came, Narasimha Rao came into the picture and globalization, privatization and all, that became the formula for growth. And as a result, for the first time in 1994, as per the recommendations of the Narasimhan Committee, they started giving licenses for new private sector banks. From 1950 to 1995, for 45 long years, no license was given to any bank. No new licenses were given. In 1995, for the first time, licenses were given for private sector banks to start and function. And those banks that were started after 1995, they are called new private sector banks. Now let me give you the list of old private sector bank as well as new private sector banks. Why I am giving a list is sometimes they will give you the name of a bank and ask you to say whether this is which bank, whether it is a foreign bank or a private sector bank or nationalized bank. Many students come and ask me, sir, how do we find out? So I have provided you a full list. Just to have a look at it and you please note very carefully, all the banks' name are ending with limited. Which are the 13 old private sector banks? They are Catholic Syrian Bank, City Union Bank Limited, Dhanalakshmi Bank Limited, Federal Bank Limited, Ingu Vaisya Bank Limited, Jammu Kashmir Bank Limited, Karnataka Bank Limited, Karur Vaisya Bank Limited, Lakshmi Vilas Bank Limited, Nainital Bank Limited, Ratnagar Bank Limited, South Indian Bank Limited, and then Tamil Nadu Mercantile Bank Limited. Of all these banks, Nainital Bank is the subsidiary of Bank of Baroda because Bank of Baroda is holding more than 90% of shares in Nainital Bank. Sometimes they may ask which is the subsidiary of Bank of Baroda or Nainital Bank is a subsidiary of which bank. That's why I added this tip to you. So these are the 13 old private sector banks who are going strong today. Then in the post-1995 era, subsequent to the innovation of Narasimha Rao, the then Prime Minister, new licenses were given for banks and 9 new private sector banks are existing today in 2016. Which are the banks? Axis Bank Limited, Development Credit Bank. Many people do not know about this Development Credit Bank. Development Credit Bank is one of the new private sector banks started. This bank was funded by the Aga Khan Fund for Economic Development, who is the promoter of this bank with around 16.3% stake, and it has its headquarters in Mumbai and various other places. It's one of the big players in the new private sector banks. Then there is also, please remember, there is also one more bank called DBS Bank. You should be able to distinguish between this DCB Bank. DCB Bank is a new private sector bank started in India. DBS Bank is a foreign bank. It is actually Development Bank Singapore. It's a foreign bank which has its branch in India, and it is also having a lot of operations in India. Therefore, you please clearly distinguish between these names which are more or less similar. DCB Bank is a new private sector bank, whereas a DBS Bank is a foreign bank. Then HDFC Bank Limited, then ICICI Bank Limited, IndusInd Bank, Kotak Mahindra Bank Limited, Yes Bank Limited, IDFC Bank Limited and Bandhan Bank Limited. This IDFC Bank Limited and Bandhan Bank Limited were given licenses in 2015. They were the recent addition to the new private sector banks. Bandhan Bank has its headquarters in Calcutta. It is a microfinance institution which converted itself into a bank. Then IDFC Bank is having its headquarters in Bombay. So these are the two new additions to the new private sector banks. Now we have seen public sector banks, then private sector banks. The third category of banks in India is foreign banks. How do we distinguish a foreign bank? What is the one significant difference between a foreign bank and a domestic or Indian bank? All other banks other than foreign banks are incorporated under Indian laws. Some of the banks under Indian Companies Act, and some of the banks were under acts promulgated by an ordinance. So, but they were all under acts of India. But on the other hand, the foreign bank company, what about the foreign banks? The foreign banks are incorporated outside India. For example, Standard Chartered Bank is incorporated in UK. They have their branches in India. HSBC Bank is incorporated in Hong Kong. They have their branches in India. Citibank is incorporated in USA. It has its branches in India. So all foreign banks are incorporated outside India and they have their branches in India. But on the other hand, other than all other banks, other than foreign bank, they are incorporated under Indian laws. That is the major difference between the foreign banks and other banks. There are about 46 foreign banks operating in India as on 31/12/2015. Now, as far as foreign banks are concerned, how Reserve Bank of India categorizes them? Reserve Bank of India categorizes them as having banks having more than 20 branches and banks having less than 20 branches. That is how it is categorized. For banks having more than 20 branches, the priority sector targets are different. For banks having less than 20 branches, the priority sector targets are different. That is how Reserve Bank of India has categorized. Among the foreign banks, we have 46 foreign banks. How many banks have more than 20 branches? Only 3 banks have more than 20 branches. The first bank is Standard Chartered Bank. It has more than 100. It has nearly 102 branches. It is the bank having the largest presence. A foreign bank having largest presence in India is Standard Chartered Bank, with having 102 branches. Next is HSBC Limited. HSBC Limited is having 50 branches, and the next is Citibank NA, which has about 45 branches in India.